Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Sure hope you had an enjoyable St. Patrick's Day earlier this week. If you're like many Americans, you likely dined on some corned beef and cabbage. Something interesting here from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They say St. Patrick's Day is the single largest promotion period for beef brisket cuts. In fact, in 2019, prices were 21% lower than they were during the rest of the year. Cabbage is also significantly cheaper this time of year, coming at nearly 40% less than the average price for the rest of the year. So if you like corned beef and cabbage, sure hope you had your fill of it this week. As we kick things off today, last month the EPA revoked all food tolerances for Chlorpyrifos. This means producers cannot apply the product on any food or feed products moving forward. This change in policy stems from concerns for public health and links to adverse effects on humans. Chlorpyrifos was first registered for use in the mid-1960s and then re-registered in 2006. Its primary uses are for corn and soybeans as well as fruit and nut trees. This product is labeled as an organophosphate insecticide. However, due to their acute toxicity to humans, most organophosphate insecticides have already been phased out of production.
It's an organophosphate, so that means is that it essentially binds to the acetylcholinesterase receptors within the brain of insects, and it's particularly effective against insects, which is why it's been so popular. And in 2007, the Pesticide Action Network of North America petitioned to have it removed because it has some neurodevelopmental effects on humans. So that was the big push for it. It was starting in 2007, so it's been a concern for quite a while now.
In short, producers planning on selling their crop as food or feed are now restricted from the use of Chlorpyrifos. Even trace amounts of the insecticide could result in being unable to market your crop.
Yeah, so it's affecting anybody who grows food or feed. So we do have a lot of row crop growers, like you mentioned, but if they're giving that grain to cattle, that is considered feed, and therefore it affects them in that situation. And so what that means is a tolerance is essentially how much of that chemical can be present on food, and this new change basically means there can be no chemical present, which essentially effectively removes the use of Chlorpyrifos on feed and food.
When it comes to the disposal of any remaining Chlorpyrifos, unfortunately options are limited. However, your local extension educators and entomology specialists can help you navigate these changes and future pest management decisions.
If you have Chlorpyrifos left over, do not use it this year. That's what we're telling people. Do not use it at all. We're still waiting on some more statements from the EPA on what they really want us to do. If you're running into issues with crop protection, then the best thing you can do is contact your local extension entomologist and see if they have any products they recommend for your area and for your crop type. There are still products out on the market, but the best person that you can talk to is your local extension entomologist. They're going to be able to help you come up with a management plan. And as for leftover products, keep those products if you want to get rid of those products. The top few things that you can do are you can contact the dealer that you purchased that product from and see if they'll take remaining product back. And you can also contact local hazardous waste or transfer stations to see if it's a small amount, if they'll take the leftover product. But if they will not, then the last possible option is contacting something like Safety Clean or Clean Harbors to see if they will take products. Not really a ton of options, which is frustrating, and I understand that completely, but don't use it on your crops because that will result in you not being able to sell your product.
If you would like to learn more about this topic and the steps you should take regarding Chlorpyrifos, we've posted a link to Jennifer's Crop Watch article on the Market Journal website. Moving on, last week we had a discussion with the state veterinarian Dr. Roger Dudley about the confirmation of highly pathogenic avian influenza here in Nebraska. Since that recording, the state has confirmed additional cases of the virus in wild geese. On Wednesday, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture announced a case of HPAI in a backyard flock in Merrick County. Here is a continuation of that interview with Dr. Dudley. What are some of the warning signs somebody should be looking for?
One of the biggest things, it often starts with a death loss. Death loss is the birds die very suddenly from this virus, or they can. But oftentimes we can also have things like decreased egg production, decreased water consumption, respiratory symptoms associated with the birds. And so those are things that we really want people to be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody does detect something like that, is it a phone call to the Nebraska Department of Agriculture their first step?
If they work with the veterinarian, local veterinarian very closely, they certainly can reach out to their local veterinarian and have a conversation. But otherwise, we should certainly welcome phone calls into the Nebraska Department of Agriculture or to USDA. USDA has a sick bird hotline that you can call into as well. So we want to get the information as soon as possible.
So you mentioned enhanced biosecurity. Let's dive a little bit deeper there. Are there a few tips in particular you want to share with our viewers today of steps they can take to keep this off their farm?
One of the best is there's some great resources that USDA has put out. There is a Defend the Flock website that is done by USDA that does a really good job, especially for backyard producers, to go out and establish a biosecurity plan and make sure you are following that plan to protect your birds. Basically, it comes down to both commercial and backyards. There's kind of 14 biosecurity principles that we really want their biosecurity plans to incorporate, which can be everything from making sure there's a biosecurity coordinator to making sure there's a line of separation and perimeter buffer area type items.
I want to leave you with the final word. What else would you like to leave for our Market Journal viewers this week to share with them about what we're learning thus far?
The biggest thing is we want everybody to be as prepared as you can be to prevent high pathogenic avian influenza from getting onto your farm by increasing biosecurity, but also report any sick birds that you see or dead birds in, so we can get on top of it as soon as we can.
Dr. Dudley, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Dudley for his time and expertise on this topic. If you missed the first part of the interview, it is available on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to learn more information about the recent detection of highly pathogenic avian influenza, you are encouraged to visit the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's website. We've taken the liberty of posting a link to that page on the Market Journal website. Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners is our grain analyst this week. We caught up with Jeff on Wednesday afternoon to get the latest information on the factors that are influencing the commodity trade. We began the conversation by asking him about the best way to describe the current corn and soybean markets. We're joined now by Jeff Peterson. He's the president of Heartland Farm Partners. Jeff, thanks for coming back to Market Journal. Good to see you.
You bet. It's great to be here, and it's always fun to talk about these markets.
A lot of things going on in the market. So let's begin with this question. How would you describe the current situation for corn and soybean, the markets and the trends that you're seeing right now?
You know, it's been interesting. When we go back, take ourselves all the way back to February 24th, when we put in some of those spike highs across corn, soybeans, and wheat. And, you know, some of the markets, we've came back up in there and got close to taking them out. Actually, as of last Friday, we had some new high closes. Not a new high move, but we had a new high close. You know, we've just kind of been trending sideways here until we had today's action, which pushed a lot of, market pressure on the markets here. And they're really just kind of sitting here, and the way I describe it, Bryce, they're kind of coiling here, I'd say. Just kind of looking for those next pieces of information to know which way they're going to go ahead and move from here.
Well, the markets are certainly keeping a close eye on the situation with Ukraine and Russia still. As we have this conversation today, I thought it'd be interesting to dive a little bit deeper in the old crop. We'll hit on the new crop here in a second, but what do we know about, in Ukraine, the old crop that's still on farms right now?
You know, that's some of the challenge that they've got right now. You know, they exported 95% of the grain actually went out their ports. You know, the rest of it would make its way out of the country by rail. And right now they don't have that ability to get out, so it's really backed up in there. Our estimation would be, from what we're hearing, on the corn side, they were planning, the USDA had them exporting about 1.3 billion. There's still about 580 million bushels of corn still physically either combination of in the grain buyers or out on the farmer storage. And then over on the wheat side, you actually still had probably about 250 million bushels plus still in on-farm storage. So that's quite a bit of grain still sitting on farm and in the grain buyers.
Do we write that off at this point, or do we say when this conflict is hopefully resolved someday, that is back in play in the market?
Yeah, that's what the market's working through right now. I'd say right now it's setting off to the side. There is some exports going out of the country, though. They are shipping out about 780,000 bushels per day by rail. And that's something that they didn't do much of before, but they are doing that. But keep in mind, their normal pace should be about 10 times that. So what that'll look at is that some of that grain will get used domestically within, but down the road, the market's trying to assess, okay, how much of that actually moves this year? Because if it doesn't move for this crop year, and keep in mind for USDA, that crop year ends on August 31st for that 2021 crop. If it doesn't move this year, then ultimately somebody else somewhere across the world, probably the U.S., will have to step in and supply more on the corn side. Wheat, necessarily, there's more suppliers than that, but we also know the challenge we run into is that we have to also talk about Russia. Since they're the #1 exporter of wheat, there's also bushels there that there's a little unknown on what's going to happen with those bushels.
So unknown, we've got a lot of questions on the old crop, but even more questions perhaps when it comes to the new crop. What are you hearing right now out of Ukraine on the possibility of getting a crop in the ground here come April?
Yeah, so see, that's a big concern. So let's kind of lay things out. So they've got wheat, they've got a wheat crop going. They also have a little bit of, and that's a hard red winter wheat crop, so that would have been in the ground. That makes up about 90% of their wheat. The other 10% would be spring wheat here, but they do have quite a bit of that wheat needs to be top dressed with nitrogen yet, so that's a concern there. In addition, you've got their planting season really close. So what you've got is that probably by starting mid-April and would like to be wrapped up towards the end of May, you got corn planting to get started. You've got sunflowers to get in as you get in towards the latter part of April. And from what we're hearing out there, the big concern, two big things come up. Obviously there's concern about fertilizer and chemicals and seed, but a lot of the suppliers have a feeling that they've got enough supply. It's whether or not they can get it to the farmer. Big concern ultimately becomes the fuel. We're hearing some reports that some farmers have enough fuel, but most of them do not have enough fuel, and that becomes a big concern. The other one I hadn't thought a lot about, but it's popping up more and more since these farmers have so much grain left yet to ship out. It's having the dollars to be able to pay for everything. So I know there's some programs that are being talked about from the Ukraine government. Question will be how much funding do they have to try to maybe get them some extra money, maybe for some bushels that they still have in on-farm storage. Our thought would be, you could have a 10 to 15% reduction on the wheat just because or it could be bigger because of the ability not to necessarily get the fertilizer on you needed or maybe the fungicides. Over on the corn side, it's hard to know yet. Maybe we're talking a minimum of 20%, but it could be upwards of 35 or 40%. So that becomes a big number because you got to figure they produce about 1.7 billion bushels of corn.
A lot of questions, obviously, as I mentioned, when it comes to Ukraine right now, Jeff. Let's travel elsewhere in the world right now. An area where we had a lot of questions was South America. Are we getting some answers when it comes to their production and what some of those numbers might look like here as they get finalized? Yeah,
I do think so. In the March WASDE report, we saw the numbers that came out from there. I think the yields down there are definitely stabilizing. It's improving yet. We may not have quite seen the lowest numbers yet out of Brazil and actually Argentina, but I think they're getting really close. But the thing we have to keep an eye on there yet is La Nina. La Nina still looks like it's going to hang around a while. That has two impacts for them. One of them is that you've still got some dryness that could show up in the southern parts of Brazil. That could impact that safrinha corn crop. Now that safrinha corn crop, that's the one that's getting planted right after these beans are harvested. That's almost all planted now. The other side of that La Nina that we don't talk about a lot, though, is that could bring in an early frost. There's some talk about that could show up in the latter parts of May, and if that's the case, Paraná and southern parts of Mato Grosso do Sul could be impacted. And so those are the areas we have to really kind of look at and think about for the safrinha crop.
Let's check back in here with the United States as we continue our conversation, Jeff. Seth in South Central Nebraska asked this question. Are the grain prices we're seeing right now the new normal? What are your thoughts?
Every time we see a run up in price, there's a lot of talk about that. So that's a great question that Seth has. We heard that talk about back in 1995 and 96 when we went over $5. We heard some of that talk in 08 and then 2012. I wouldn't say this is a new normal. I would say that we've had some problems here on the supply side across the world, and as a result of that, the markets will adjust down the road. So at some point in here, we'll have to get multiple year sales on, but I don't think that's the new normal for now.
Something else happening here in the U.S. We've got avian influenza. High-path avian influenza is back. First time since 2015. We've been talking about that here on the program as it has an impact on the poultry industry, of course. But when it comes to the grain market, are there anything in particular you're watching with that?
Yeah, we're continuing to watch it. I think the last count is about 7 million birds have been culled. You know, if you go back and look at the 2015, we've been up around the 50 million. So we aren't to that level yet. But, you know, every bushel that's physically not end up fed, we're watching it from the feed demand side. You know, could it get to a point that it's market moving with everything else we have on? No, we don't think so. But it's still something we have to watch, Bryce.
All right, Jeff, final word is yours. 30 seconds or so. What piece of risk management advice would you like to leave us with, or perhaps something we haven't had the chance to hit on yet?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we want to make sure we're doing now is make sure you are taking advantage of these higher prices. Even though we don't think that the highs have been put in yet, it's going to be very volatile. Price action back and forth, limit moves higher, limit moves lower. Just make sure you're managing risk through all this, Bryce.
Jeff, as always, it's great to have you here on Market Journal. Appreciate your insight.
You bet. Always enjoy it.
Thanks to Jeff for his time this week. Now, next week, we'll be joined by Todd Holtman of DTN. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, be sure to get in touch with us on social media, and I'll be sure to pass your question along. As spring rolls around, schools across the state are headed out for field trips and hands-on educational experiences. Several of the state's commodity organizations are also offering a host of educational materials and resources from their websites to improve agriculture knowledge of the students. The Nebraska Wheat Growers Association, Nebraska Corn Board, Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board, and the Nebraska Soybean Board all offer teacher and student resources from their websites to help students learn more about agriculture in our state and all around the globe. You can learn more about these resources in the March issue of the Nebraska Farmer. What is now time for our weekly weather segment with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, another mild week here after the time change last weekend. As the days get longer, are we going to see the weather become more spring-like?
Well, Bryce, we did see some very warm temperatures during the early part of the week, and of course we've seen the storm system move through Thursday and Friday, and we got another one on Monday and Tuesday. And when you combine all the precipitation from those, it looks like a broad area of the central and southern plains, especially the southern half of Nebraska, is going to see some significant moisture if everything pans out as the models are currently forecasting. We've accumulated some pretty significant deficits this winter in terms of precipitation, so it is encouraging that we're starting to see more spring-like weather developing, particularly to our south, where they've basically been in drought conditions since late last summer. This shall help bring some of the short-term departures at least back to normal. We're still working on some of those longer-term deficits that we've accumulated since late last summer. So if we look at the upper air model, the first thing we'll draw your attention to is that we got this large system that's going to start to sweep across the country. But this weekend is going to be very nice in advance of that trough moving in from the west. We're going to be looking at widespread 70s across the state, and we'll start to see the winds picking up as we get closer to the event on Monday. Pretty much high pressure is in control across the southern plains. The system that impacted us during the latter half of the week is now moving over to the eastern United States, and by the time we get into Sunday, this upper air low is going to dig very deep. That's going to bring a big fetch of moisture northward, and depending on the speed of this system is going to really impact how significant the moisture is for the southern half of Nebraska and points to the south. We get into Monday, this system starts to lift out into the plains region, so this fetch of moisture will wrap around this system, can bring widespread precipitation to at least the southern half of the state as we go on Monday, and that we can see that starting to spread toward the north and toward the east. Most of northern Nebraska looks like to be much drier than the southern part of the state. Now on Tuesday, this trough starts to open up somewhat, but the surface low will be up near Kansas City. That should wrap that moisture around and toward the west, and that should give us some upslope flow conditions across western Nebraska. See a mixture of rain and snow with more snow toward the Dakotas. On Wednesday, the system basically peters out somewhat. We do see some cold air coming into the backside of it. The surface low gets far away from the main trough in the Ohio River Valley, but we still should spread some moisture up into this region with severe weather across the southeast. Light snowfall activity on the backside of this low. Doesn't look like anything significant yet in terms of accumulations. On Thursday, we're going to get that northwest flow on the backside of this trough with a little cooler conditions. So enjoy this weekend. We're going to see temperatures that are going to be back down to more normal conditions in the 50s as we get the second half of the week. And by Friday, we start to dig upper our trough. So we're going to see a couple pieces of energy pivot around this cooler conditions. There does look like to be a surface low development in northeastern Colorado that should aid for some convergence, but right now most of the major precipitation is going to stay up toward northwest. 8 to 14 day forecast is indicating warmer conditions building into the western United States with the cool conditions moving to the east of us. And in terms of precipitation, much drier conditions are anticipated by the models, at least from precipitation standpoint, with very dry conditions. I will say this, however, there is another storm system on the GFS model that looks like it's going to come in the 26th, 27th. If that verifies, this is way overdone in terms of dryness. It looks like we could see another widespread precipitation event. So overall, we're thankful for the precipitation chances as we go forward, and it does look like the active pattern will continue at least into the early part of April.
Thanks, Al. Finally, today, with input costs on the rise in crop production, you may want to consider making the use of manure in order to offset some of those rising fertilizer costs. At this year's Women in Ag event in Kearney, Nebraska, Extension educator Leslie Johnson shared insight into the magic of manure. Market Journal's Bill Dodd brings us this story.
Input costs for virtually all Nebraska row crops have continued to climb in the last year, with little indication of prices going down anytime soon. One major component of any cropping system is the use of fertilizer. With that in mind, manure is one alternative producers can turn to try and offset some of those fertilizer input cost increases. However, before you make any applications, soil testing should be your first priority.
And you should soil sample before you apply manure, but always do it before manure application. I will occasionally get somebody that calls and says, well, I want to account for those manure nutrients, and so I'm sampling afterwards. And a soil sample is a snapshot on that day. So because nitrogen becomes available from manure over time, it's not going to tell you what is available to your crop 2 months from now, 2 weeks from now, even 2 years from now, because nitrogen does become available over the course of 3-4 years from manure. And then if you're going to apply manure multiple years or after a few years, sample again. And if you're going to do it in the spring, always do it in the spring. Whatever you do, do it consistently. So if you're going to apply manure in the fall, you need to sample before that application. But if you're going to apply in the spring, it might be hard, but you need to get that soil sample before then, so you can base that nitrogen rate or that manure rate on those nutrients that are in the soil. So anything that you have in your manure should be utilized as a fertilizer. So getting that sample and knowing what you have in there is really important.
Like all things in life, there can be drawbacks to any decision. However, Leslie tells us when it comes to utilizing manure on your operation, if you're doing things properly, the only drawback to making use of manure as fertilizer could be minor water concerns and perhaps a complaint or two from a neighbor about odor.
I would say there's not really drawbacks. Of course, there's always the neighbor issue, because manure does have an odor to it most of the time. There are some products that don't really have an odor to them, but most of the time that's the biggest issue. There are some water quality concerns if you're not doing it properly, but if you're applying that manure on an agronomic basis, so it's just meeting the crop needs, there's really not a lot of concern. If you get a hard rain right after you've applied, you're more likely to lose some of those nutrients, and and that can cause water quality problems. But mostly, if you're doing it right, you're probably not causing a problem.
When it comes to how much manure you'll need to make your applications, it all boils down to your soil needs and making sure that you don't exceed the tolerable amount of nitrogen to ensure leaching doesn't become an issue.
So it's going to depend on your operation and what you have available. If you just have available a certain amount of manure available, just knowing how much nutrients that you've applied with that manure, then you can not offset, but you reduce your fertilizer by that amount. So it just depends on the operation. If you have enough manure to meet all of your nitrogen needs, you can do that. But you don't want to go past that nitrogen need. So sometimes in order to meet all of your phosphorus needs for 1 or 2 years, it might be more than the amount of nitrogen that you need, but you should never go over that amount of nitrogen, because that nitrogen is going to leach into the soil and it eventually gets to our groundwater. And so it's a potential contaminant that you definitely need to manage.
If you want to procure manure for your operation but don't know where to start, have no fear. UNL has an app for that. However, Beyond university resources that can assist producers in obtaining a sufficient amount of manure for their operations, Leslie tells us, some people you may already know may be willing to simply give you what you need if you're willing to ask.
The university actually we have a manure app, and while it's not going to get you directly to a manure source, it will put you in touch with consultants that are working with livestock operations. Sometimes it's just knocking on the neighbor's door and asking them, do you have that extra manure? Can we get some? Sometimes they're glad to get rid of it. Sometimes their land is already applied to and they need a place to get rid of it, and so they'll gladly give it to you. Other times you're going to have to pay for that manure. It just depends. But knocking on the neighbor's door is one way. The university actually has an app that's available through our manure.unl.edu website. That app does, like I said, it does not get you in touch with the manure person directly, but it will get you in contact with consultants and brokers that have access to manure. And the other part of that app is it gets access to our manure team. So if you have questions for any manure related question, all of our all of our University of Nebraska Extension people that are involved with manure have their contact information in there, and you can find somebody local to you, or you can come talk to me because I'm a statewide.
While manure has its benefits as a fertilizer, it shouldn't be overlooked that manure can usually be locally sourced and cuts down on the need for fertilizers to be shipped via trucks, ships, and trains over long distances. When properly applying manure in your fields, you're essentially applying a byproduct that was likely created from the commodities being produced on that land, in effect, helping to create a circular economy. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks for that story, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about using manure management and its many benefits as a fertilizer, there's a plethora of information online at UNL's water webpage. You can find a link to that URL attached to the story on Market Journal's website, as well as on all of our social media pages. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, you can watch the entire show online at our YouTube channel. You can also like and follow Market Journal on social media to join in on the conversation. We hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Duskett. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.